And I'm going to refer to page numbers. So please take a look at the book. It has all of the information there that I'm hoping to show you here today. Okay, so the first trial I'm going to talk about, actually it's not a trial, is our Northwestern Minnesota IPM survey. So each year we have a series of scouts that go out and take a look at what's happening in the field. And that's so we can provide in-season pest management information dealing with the pests that you're dealing with. So relevant information on time. So this project was sponsored by Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council. So some of the data that was collected in the field, we looked at both adult and nymph grasshoppers, and scouts would sweep the grassy field edges. We also looked at bean leaf beetles and the feeding injury that they cause. There weren't many of those this year. And lastly, here, two-spotted spider mites both on the field edge and then inside of the field. So field edge populations are beginning stages of them entering the field from that grassy field border area. Once they enter into the field, it becomes a little bit more serious. So here's one of the maps. So there's tons of maps here in the book. Showing what we found over time throughout the growing season. So this was right towards the beginning of the experiment, or the survey. Earlier on in the growing season, the scouts had been looking at wheat fields. So when they switched to soybeans, first thing they saw was quite a few grasshopper nymphs. So each of the little black dots there is a field that was visited sometime during this week, June 5th through 9th, and they didn't find any grasshopper nymphs. The little green triangles, that's showing between 1 and 25 nymphs in that field border. The reason why this matters is because one of the ways that we determine whether or not to treat grasshoppers is based on grasshopper population density. So on field edges, or the field margins, it's more than 50 nymphs or more than 20 adults. So if you have that number, you've reached your treatment threshold, you should really consider a pesticide application. At the end of each series of maps in the research trial book is a link to specific management recommendations for that particular pest. So within the field, so once the grasshoppers move into the field, those treatment thresholds drop a bit. So 30 nymphs or 8 adults. That's where our treatment thresholds are. We also have, especially this becomes handy when you have multiple defoliators in the field, we have defoliation injury-based treatment thresholds as well. So in vegetative soybeans, we go with the 30% defoliation injury. This is what 30% looks like, and that's on average throughout the entire plant, throughout the field. Unfortunately, this dot is right in the middle of this picture. So once we hit the vegetative or the reproductive growth stages, that threshold drops down to 20%. Now the reason why we use these thresholds is really to take all of the emotion and just subjectivity out of that decision. We also have designed thresholds so that there's time to make a pesticide application before you have significant yield loss. So this is just one example of the sort of information this survey provides. We also looked at soybean growth stage, soybean incidence and severity. So incidence is the percentage of plants in a field that are infested with soybean aphids. Severity is the average number of aphids that you found per plant. Again, treatment thresholds for soybean aphid are, does anybody recall how many aphids per plant on average? 250. All right, 250, right. So 250 soybean aphids per plant on average. That population is growing, and 80% of the plants are infested. So in addition to looking at soybean aphid incidence and severity, we also looked for evidence of parasitism. So soybean aphid has several natural enemies that can help to provide a bit of control. So these individuals here have been, a parasitic wasp has laid an egg within them, and that egg is hatched, and the growing insect inside is eating and swelling the aphid tissue there. So natural enemies, it's an important thing to look for. It's something we saw quite a bit of delay in observing this year. Several consultants and I both suggest that we just had a lag in the development of natural enemies in 2023. So here's an example of our soybean aphid severity. This is July 17th through 28th. I personally visited these fields, so the red triangles in Mahnomen, and this is Clay County, they had threshold level aphid populations. Unfortunately, I went back and took a look at these fields in Mahnomen County, and some of those densities were in the thousands. So I think some people weren't necessarily scouting or treating on time. Another thing that we looked for were some of the new soybean pests in the state. So soybean gall midge was found a couple years ago in southwestern Minnesota. So we didn't add any more counties infested, where we found infested fields to the map. And so far we haven't found it in northwestern Minnesota. These pictures I took, and this is soybean tentiform leaf miner. This guy was found for the first time in southeast Minnesota in 2021. So we were looking hard for it. I found some of these populations both in eastern and western Marshall County. Where I found them were close to wooded areas. It's thought that these insects will overwinter in that leaf litter in the basically underneath a forest, sort of. So what you can see here is that they kind of create this little mine here as they eat away the tissue. And then it's very hard to see from the top of the leaf. And so if you have a habit when you go out and scout your soybeans of just flipping over leaves, that's really hard to miss. If you see something and aren't really sure, just give me a call. This is another one we saw a lot in 2023. So for identification purposes, what you're seeing here are three pairs of true legs. We have 3 pro legs on this abdomen, and then right at the rear end is another set of pro legs. What is this? Green clover worm. So this was a bad one throughout parts of northwestern Minnesota this past year. What some people have run into, if you also have a soybean aphid population, knowing that we have pyrethroid resistance sort of limits the pesticides we're able to use. And so I do have some information in the book about what to consider when it comes to managing multiple pests at the same time. One thing to consider, always make sure that the pest is still there, so you actually have something to control. I will have a little bit more time to talk about this at the small grains updates. Those begin January 9th, and go through January 12th at locations in northwest Minnesota. One last thing I figured that you all would have an interest in. So you might be aware that on November 2nd, a federal court threw out the US EPA rule, basically effectively banning chlorpyrifos. If you'll recall, that's the organophosphate active ingredient in, for example, Lorsban. So basically, EPA was ordered to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate whether chlorpyrifos can be safely used on food and feed crops. So I know you guys would have an interest in understanding whether you could, in 2024, use that stockpile of Lorsban you have in the back of your chemical shed. So I talked to people at MDA to figure that out. I spoke with a scientist who says, first things first, the federal government, the federal EPA has to re-register the product. And then it isn't automatic that it's registered here in the state. What then needs to happen, you might not know this, I didn't know this, there are many more chemicals registered federally than there are in Minnesota. And that's because it's not an automatic process to get things registered in Minnesota. The manufacturers actually have to apply for registration. So currently, chlorpyrifos, it's illegal to use, sell, or distribute chlorpyrifos in the state of Minnesota. I know that they will, thanks David, I know that they will be keeping us abreast of the situation at MDA, so expect to see some press releases coming out as we get closer to the growing season. So in the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through. We have some SCN data to share with you. So, so far, from 2023, 365 samples have been processed, and here's the way that they fall out. So, this population density, you can't plant a susceptible variety and expect to not get yield loss, but 33% of samples fell into this egg count category. The reason why we're concerned about egg counts is because that's how we really recommend management recommendations. Population densities between 2,000 and 10,000, at that density you can expect some yield loss, even when growing a resistant soybean variety. Of more concern are those 10% of samples that were higher than that. And those densities, soybean production isn't necessarily recommended, and that's because yield loss that's expected is just going to be a little bit too high. Our record was this one sample that was 106,000 eggs per in a little bit less than a half a cup of soil. That's a problem. These densities are increasing over time, and so I'm so glad to hear Aaron's information about all of the SCN breeding projects that you have ongoing, because we really need it. Here's where the samples were throughout the state. Here's where the 106,000 location was. That's Renville County. That's near a town called Olivia. But it's not to say that anywhere else, particularly in the southern part of the state, where SCN first moved into the state, doesn't have the same risk. The information in the book is a little bit outdated because we had to turn it in before I had this many samples. So, one last thing I was supposed to cover in 15 minutes. Thank goodness. Frogeye leaf spot just didn't have a foothold in 2023. So the pathogen, the fungus that causes frogeye leaf spot, likes warm weather. It also likes very humid weather. And so that's one thing we did not have in abundance in 2023. That's it. One last thing, there's a couple handouts in the back on the table there. One is basically advertising a series of webinars that start in January and go through March. Those are sponsored by Minnesota Soybean and by Minnesota Corn. And then I have a card there with my contact information.